Welcome, friends, to this presentation on exceptionally queer sexuality and gender in Mormonism with this outstanding group of presenters. Historians Katie Mormon and Taylor Petry, interviewed by Jim Mitulski. I am Mark Bowman, Executive Director of the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network, the host of tonight's program. LGBTQ RAN is a unique venture dedicated to preserving the history of LGBTQ religious movements around the world. LGBTQ RAN is a digital enterprise. We are not a physical repository that stores papers. We advise and support leaders and groups in their efforts to preserve their records in appropriate archives. Furthermore, we provide a treasure of historical information in digital form on our website about LGBTQ plus persons and groups from a wide array of religious expressions around the world. And finally, we encourage research and scholarship in queer religious history. We are pleased tonight to host an intriguing conversation with Katie Mormon, author of the newly published Exceptionally Queer, Mormon Peculiarity and U.S. Nationalism, and Taylor Petry, author of the 2020 Tabernacles of Clay, Sexuality and Gender in Modern Mormonism. Katie's critical work is a powerful rethinking of Mormonism and its place in U.S. history, culture, and politics, arguing that Mormon peculiarity is a potent expression of U.S. exceptionalism. Taylor's research posits that Mormonism is conflicted between ontologies of gender essentialism and gender fluidity, illustrating a broader tension in the history of sexuality in modernity itself. Katie Mormon, Ph.D., is a clinical teaching track associate professor in the ethnic study program at the University of Colorado, Denver. Her work examines formations and histories of sexuality, race, religion, gender, and nation in the context of 19th, 20th, and 21st century U.S. imperialism. She received the 2018-19 LGBTQ Religious History Award for a chapter of this newly published book, Exceptionally Queer. Taylor G. Petry, Ph.D., is an associate professor of religion at Kalamazoo College and chair of the religion department. He holds a Ph.D. and an MTS from Harvard Divinity School and is the current editor of Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought. Mormon and Petry will be interviewed by the Reverend Dr. Jim Mitulski, a pastor, activist, community organizer, and fundraiser who serves on the LGBTQ RAN Board of Directors. Jim has pastored churches in the United Church of Christ and the Metropolitan Community Churches. He served as a denominational director of development and clergy vocations for the MCC churches and taught courses at the Pacific School of Religion and currently at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. To those of you watching this webinar, we welcome your comments or questions in the chat box or the Q&A function. The presenters will respond to those during the Q&A time toward the end of tonight's program. If you would like to offer personal greetings or comments to any of the presenters, stay after the webinar has concluded and you will be invited into the Zoom room with them. Please direct any technical concerns to Asadi, who is the tech manager for this program. Now, I am pleased to welcome moderator Jim Mitulski to begin this conversation on exceptionally queer sexuality and gender in Mormonism.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I want to welcome my two colleagues and interview subjects, Katie and Taylor, both of whom have written some of the most interesting books I've read so far this year. And that's in every discipline possible. I really want to urge you to check out both of their books because it is about everything. It's about religion, it's about sexuality, they're about Mormonism, they're about queer identity then and now, It's about race and about politics. Everything is in these books. And we're going to hear each of them talk about their scholarship, about what drew them to it, and why it's important. So I'm going to ask them each to just say a little bit first about what drew them to this topic. Katie, what got you into it? Do your 5-minute elevator speech. And then Taylor, I'm going to ask you to do the same. And between the two of you, be sure to cover this. What do you mean by the word queer? And what do you mean by the word Mormon?
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to have this conversation and that Taylor is here being a part of it. I'm really grateful to the LGBTQ Archives Network. So in terms of how I got interested in this project, I did not grow up Mormon. I should say that at the outset. I was not raised Mormon, despite my last name. It's just a coincidence, I promise. But I did grow up queer in Salt Lake City. So I was surrounded by Mormonism my entire life, and how I came to understand myself as a queer person was definitely influenced by growing up in a Mormon cultural space. I learned really quickly on that it was not okay to say, "Oh God," but you could say the F word, as in not F you, but the other F word. So that was an interesting learning experience as a child. So when I got into my graduate school experience, I started out really wanting to talk about what does it mean to have queer community in a place like Utah, in a place that's really religiously conservative. And that put me down a rabbit hole of Mormonism. And I became a Mormon studies scholar who felt like I needed to write this book about why people think Mormonism is so peculiar and what's going on with that impulse to call it peculiar, before I could really get at what does it mean to be a queer person in Utah. So that's kind of where I came from. In terms of the terms you asked us to define, in the book itself, I'm using queer in a variety of ways, but primarily I'm using queer in its theoretical sense. So queer theory and queer of color critique are two major analytical frameworks that I'm using to understand this idea that Mormonism is somehow inherently peculiar, when I use queer theory to challenge that idea. Since Mormonism and queerness are often thought about as peculiar in similar ways, thus kind of the title of my book. In terms of Mormon, I use that term really broadly to refer to people who identify themselves as being a part of the Latter-day Saint tradition, so descended from teachings of Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. And I don't use it necessarily to just refer to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but lots of different churches and people who identify with the Mormon tradition. So with that, I'll hand it over to Taylor.
All right. Pardon me. I'm just getting over a little bit of a sickness, so hopefully my voice holds up throughout everything. But I also want to thank everybody who's invited us here tonight. I'm really excited for the conversation, and it's really a pleasure to get to speak with the two of you, Jim and Katie, as well. So I grew up also in Salt Lake City, just south of Salt Lake, in one of the suburbs, as a cis-het white Mormon boy there. Went off to New York City for undergraduate, and then to Boston for graduate school, and was kind of interested in gender issues all the way back in high school. It was hard not to be growing up in the 90s. You had the Don't Say Gay bills, or the Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Sorry, I'm getting my time periods mixed up. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was coming on, and one of the big things that happens in the Latter-day Saint context in the 1990s is a major proclamation on gender and sexuality that comes out really right as I started actually as a missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And that ended up really kind of defining my entire adult life as a Latter-day Saint. And it was a kind of peculiar document where the church really kind of states very forcefully a strong position on male-female marriage, on male-female binary gender identity, and really kind of like I say, sort of is the defining thing of what modern Mormonism was in my adult life. And I, in some ways, I guess was always kind of curious about that. When I started studying religion in graduate school, I was actually studying early Christianity, but I was looking at gender studies in early Christianity, and was sort of happy to kind of just have some interesting questions about Mormonism, but not really to have them as research areas. But then another major kind of defining thing happened in the tradition, which is that the church got heavily involved in the Proposition 8 politics of California, opposing same-sex marriage there. And I was in graduate school at the time studying gender, and I remember feeling deeply, deeply embarrassed by what the church had done. I remember watching with a great deal of shame the protests that were happening outside of the temples in New York City and Los Angeles and other areas, and thought, okay, I think I need to think through this a little bit more. And when I first started writing and thinking about it, I saw it really as a kind of theological problem that the church needed to deal with. And so my early attempts of kind of looking at this, the issue of LGBTQ identities and the Latter-day Saint tradition were theological. But over the course of the next few years, I realized that I really needed to understand the history a lot more. And I began a kind of historical study that ended up being the results of this, or the book Tabernacles of Clay, where I wanted to lay out how it is that the church came to embrace heterosexuality as the core of its identity. And I expected that the story would be very different than how it turned out once I started doing the research. And that was a sort of happy and interesting surprise. And so that's sort of where I came to the project. In terms of the terms, like Katie, the notion of queer theory is sort of at the heart of how I come to approach it, though I think we're coming at, usefully different, slightly different angles at it, where I'm looking at the sort of blurred binaries between hetero and homosexuality, between male and female, as some of the driving questions that I'm trying to understand how the church had come to approach those issues. And for the most part, the mainstream Latter-day Saint movement of the broad umbrella of Mormon traditions, the mainstream Latter-day Saint tradition is the primary one that I look at in the analysis of the book. Again, just for the subject, the research of narrowing it down. It doesn't mean other projects aren't worth looking at, but that's kind of how I came to approach the project.
Katie, you're clearly a historian, and Taylor, you are too, but you also are interested in theology in a sense, in a way, and theology and history are intertwined. But you, Katie, delve so much into the 19th century origins and evolution of Mormon history, theology, and what was happening in the United States at the time. And in some ways, what the conservative nature of today's politics are no surprise. What surprised you most in your research about the history of Mormonism and the history of the United States, the paired history?
I think when I first started, I was surprised that Mormonism was so central to the American story, or to the history of the United States, especially in terms of its politics, and its politics as a settler colonial nation, and its politics as a nation that was invested in projects of racialization that then justified that settler colonialism. I was really shocked to find Mormonism there, only because growing up in Salt Lake, where Mormonism is predominant and is at the center, I was taught Mormonism was peripheral. So that was a humongous shocker. And as you kind of mentioned, I was not a religious studies scholar. I wasn't in a Mormon studies focused program. Me doing religion was kind of a shocker to the other people around me. So as I kind of learned this myself, I was teaching my committee and my fellow grad students as they went along, and they also looked at me like I had three heads when I said, no, this is actually really central. And that's actually one of the things I hope comes out of the book, is I would like to bring Mormon studies, religious studies, together with American studies, gender and sexuality studies, ethnic studies, because I think those fields actually have a lot to say to one another, but they are so blinded by Mormon peculiarity, dare I use my own term from the book, that it's hard for them to speak to one another. So that's kind of one of the goals I have, and was one of the main surprises, but doesn't surprise me anymore.
Did you have surprises in your own study as it evolved in your own research, things that you really just didn't anticipate, the extent to which something became evidently true?
Is that for me?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, I would say that, I mean, there were so many surprises, and as any research project develops, it's never what you think it's going to be. Whatever the best designed research proposal at the beginning is never what it looks like in the end. But there was one surprise that I think that stood out for me that I still remain a little bit shocked by. And it's the idea that Latter-day Saints developed that gender is sort of unchanging, that it's this eternal element of what someone's identity is. As I mentioned, there was that 1995 document that the church put out that sort of is a kind of official declaration of the church's teachings. And it says gender is an essential characteristic of your identity, and it's unchanging. And that it's something that will persist after death, and it's something that belonged to your soul or your identity before you were even born, before you came to this earth. So it's this kind of very strong sense that your identity and gender are kind of inseparable. And I was curious about the history of that doctrine, which became sort of official in 1995. And I was really shocked to discover that just a few decades before that, in the 60s and 70s, church leaders were teaching the exact opposite. They were teaching that if you weren't faithful to your gender in this life, you would lose it in the next life. And in fact, the vast majority of people would have no gender in the next life, because the vast majority of people were going to be unfaithful, unfit to have sexual difference at all. And they were also teaching that before you were born, you maybe chose your gender, that you had some element of, that there was some element of choice there. And so there was this idea that gender was actually an incredibly fragile and contingent feature of your identity in the 60s and 70s. And so I was fascinated with, how did the church change so abruptly from teaching that gender was fluid, that gender was contingent, that gender was something that that might change, to thinking, no, it's absolutely fixed, it's absolutely essential, it's absolutely binary, and what that process was. And so trying to untangle that particular development of doctrine was kind of one of the puzzles that I was working on. And I was most surprised at how recent the change had occurred within my own lifetime, which I hadn't realized.
And this is related to its discussion around race. Is that true? I mean,
Absolutely. Yes.
I mean, Katie, that's essential to your research, right? That, I mean, you can't really unseparate these threads or these strands.
Yeah, and that's where I think for both Taylor and I, queer theory becomes a really important analytical framework for us, so that we can talk about those things together, even though they're typically not talked about together necessarily in everyday life. But when you look back at the historical record, it becomes apparent how very much, for example, just to riff off of what Taylor was just talking about, the logics of gender and sexuality for church leaders were very much tied to white supremacist logics that they were discussing and circulating at the same time. And in fact, to go back to the previous question you asked before about what was surprising, I think a lot of Mormon studies scholars are, or just people looking from the outside, are like, how did Mormons go from pariahs, social pariahs, to thought about as mainstream model Americans in some ways? And this question of how they flipped their views on gender, sexuality, and race sits right at the center of that. And Taylor really focused on like, how did that take shape fully in the mid 20th century? I kind of look a little bit earlier at how does that transition take place around the turn of the 20th century. So how are they able to assimilate so quickly after they get rid of polygamy? And partly that's because they are able to say, hey, look, we've been expressing white supremacist views all along. Hey, look, we have these humongous families that are going to help us stop the country from being susceptible to race suicide of white people. So these logics are very much intertwined. And then in the 20th century, as Taylor talks about in his book, it becomes codified in really stark ways.
I mean, reading your material, Katie, I was, here I'm a layperson saying this, at least as a historian, thinking the 19th century LDS people were super American. I mean, they were really believers, true believers in what was evolving in the American consciousness, in a sense. And yet we're seen as so different. What happened?
Well, so this gets at the crux of the argument I come to in the book, which is that Mormon peculiarity, which is a concept I come up with to talk about how Mormons are always talked about as strange or unique or other, that really develops as a corollary to, or as a version of, American exceptionalism, the discourse of American exceptionalism. So you're right, Jim, from the very beginning, Mormonism had baked into kind of its foundational thinking, US is an exceptional nation that's going to allow for a lot of things that perhaps other nations haven't in the past. But there's some major divergences that occur, particularly around views about race, views about gender and sexuality. But fundamentally at the core, there's a lot of overlap between especially white Mormons and white non-Mormons in the early years. So that divergence, though, becomes bigger and bigger and bigger as polygamy is outed as something that's really essential to the church.
So we've seen change in the 20th century, or at the turn of the 20th century, and into the 20th century on race in Mormonism. And you can see how that could happen. And even more recently, the discourse around Black Lives Matter, just a kind of a conflicted discourse, right? I mean, do you think that there could be a similar change on gender and sexuality? A revelation?
I really want to hear Taylor answer this first. I'm really curious what Taylor thinks, and then I will chime in with my thoughts.
Well, my common answer is that we're historians, not fortune tellers. So I cannot tell what the future is going to be, but I will give some general thoughts on this. I think that one way of maybe understanding where the Latter-day Saints are at in the present moment is to kind of understand the past, of course, and to know that the church has often found itself, and sometimes of its own doing, in this kind of conflictual relationship with the broader culture, and often kind of prides itself on staking out an exceptional or a peculiar position relative to the society around it. And you can also look back on the times that the church has done that and say that in almost all cases they lost those battles in the long term. And there are a couple that I think are directly relevant here. First, of course, is plural marriage or polygamy, where the church challenges broader cultural norms and loses that fight quite spectacularly, and abandons it. And it actually ends up causing a rift in the church. And you get the emergence of the first, what we call fundamentalist Mormons, who continue to practice plural marriage, but are not associated with the church. This happens again over marriage issues, or at least somewhat related to marriage issues, with respect to interracial marriage in the 1960s and 1970s, as interracial marriage is also gaining legal and social acceptability in the United States. It's also causing a huge fracture inside the LDS Church over this issue. What are we going to do about this question? And it's results then in a major revelation, as you mentioned, Jim, that changes the church's teachings on race, and eventually hopes that that's going to be a solution to its race problem. Of course, it isn't, and that's another story. But I think that we're now in this interesting moment where similarly the church is struggling to find its place, as not all, but many other churches are as well, struggling to find an answer to where they're going to land on the same-sex marriage issue. They very clearly have staked out a strong conservative position for several decades and have been working to somewhat moderate that position in recent years since the Supreme Court decision in 2015, maybe starting even a little bit before that, but have not been willing to admit that change is really possible at this point. So in the near term, there doesn't seem to be any prospects on the horizon that the church is going to change its teachings on same-sex marriage. It has, however, attempted to make a number of other minor accommodations here and there, certainly but far from perfect, but it did update its policy around trans identity in 2020, I think, which made some moderate accommodations, made some other things in sort of the opposite direction. But the church is in some ways trying to see, like, well, what are the boundaries that we can push and what are the things that we can't? And I think it's experimenting around the edges a little bit. They're far from making any, I think there's nothing really in the short term, as I said, that there's to expect any dramatic changes that would eliminate a hierarchy between homosexuality and heterosexuality, or allow same-sex marriage, or to ordain women, or to consider trans identity as fully within the gender of their identity. So, not in the near term, but again, I think that if we look in the long historical arc of the church, it has often ended up making accommodations that it said were impossible in a previous generation. So it's not outside of the realm of possibility, but it's not looking particularly likely in the near term. That's my answer. I don't know. Again, Katie has a totally different historical perspective on this, so I'm curious to hear their take as well.
I think I largely agree with you, Taylor, on your assessment. I mean, you look historically, they have made accommodations to things they have said they would never, ever do. So I think the possibility is there. Never say never, right? But I think if you compare specifically what happened with the changing of the policy in 1978 around Black priesthood versus this conversation about how does the church approach same-sex marriage or identity or trans identity, I think there's some key differences there. So one thing I have noticed is that, and I think this actually requires much further study and would be an excellent comparison for scholars, is I think there's much more of a lay push on the part of Mormons for the church to accommodate LGBTQ people and fully accept and bring them into the fold. And I don't think at all, based on my limited research on this topic, that happened in that way for Black priesthood holding. That, in fact, white supremacy was rampant and very far entrenched, and is still a major issue in the church. So I think those differences are really important. I also think it was really important theological differences, since, as we know now from scholarship, the banning of full priesthood holding for Black people in the church was not based in theology. It was based in certain leaders' decisions, even though it became over time taught as something that was theological and was believed to be theological by some leaders. I think there's somewhat more roadblocks theologically to same-sex marriage, if we're just going to talk about that one issue. Although I think what you referenced before, there's actually maybe more theological wiggle room in terms of gender expansiveness, which is awesome. So it's an interesting comparison, but I do think it's just a time will tell kind of situation.
Part of what I want to appreciate about both of you is you take, it's a less than 200-year period, and do a very deep dive in different areas, of it, and with different emphases, but and some overlap, but still a very deep dive in a way that has not been done too much in previous generations, partly because the access to the material wasn't available, partly because it wasn't permitted in some ways. But you have done a very deep dive over a relatively short period of time. So could you still say it is evolving? Could it change as much? I mean, if you take it in 50-year increments or generational increments.
Yeah, I will say that there are really important sort of pioneer researchers from a generation before us that did really, really important work. And I'll just highlight Conal O'Donovan and D. Michael Quinn as two particular individuals who were working in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and putting together our religious archive in many cases of the primary source documents and tracking down so many amazing things. And I would say both of our research is really dependent on earlier generations of fantastic scholars and activists who helped to think through some of these issues. Jim, I think it's such a great point to note, and it's something that I say frequently, that if a Latter-day Saint from 50 years ago were transported future into time and attended a Sunday service session today, it would look nothing like what they were practicing 50 years ago. And if you had done it for 100 years ago, similarly, it would look nothing like that. The music was different. When the meetings were different. Who was allowed to pray at the meetings was different. All kinds of changes happen in that slow, incremental way that make the tradition in some ways unrecognizable to itself over time. That's not a unique feature for Latter-day Saints. I think all religious traditions involve in incremental ways like that. But certainly, even on issues relating to race and gender that we've been talking about, the church has made dramatic changes in that amount of time. And so that's where I think both of us are reluctant to say, no, it could never change, or it's impossible to change, because historical change is inevitable. Is it inevitably progressive? No. That's the other side of things. Just to make the point, race and the church's kind of dramatic reversal on race is one of the places that people look to as a kind of model or a place of hope here. And there's something worth looking at there. I think it's issues relating to feminism are maybe another interesting analog here, because the church very strongly resisted the feminist movement, came out as an anti-feminist activist church, opposed actively the Equal Rights Amendment, the sort of height of the feminist agenda in the it had been for 50 years, but in the 1970s and early 1980s, and was instrumental in defeating the Equal Rights Amendment. At the same time, the church ended up adopting a lot of kind of moderate feminist positions over the years. They ended up sort of saying egalitarian marriage as opposed to hierarchical marriage is maybe okay after all. but it never really made a full kind of acceptance of feminism. The church does not ordain women. One of the few, mainstream American churches besides Catholicism that doesn't anymore, as of course, many evangelical churches don't, but, and so it could be that we might see issues around sexuality and gender identity follow a similar pattern that the church adopted with respect to feminism, where it may make some accommodations, but never really fully embrace them either. So, we could be in for a much longer haul here if that's the case, if that's the direction that this goes.
Well, and just to add one thing to that, I think good comparison with feminism. It also, I think, depends on if the church continues a pattern of either accommodation or change that is official. We're going to change this rule or the way this is written or whatever. But is there anything underneath that structurally that supports it? So, for example, there was the reversal of the Black priesthood ban in 1978, but there wasn't any structural support for what that looked like on the ground in wards. And that meant that there was confusion, number one. And number two, still a lot of the ideas that justified the ban or were thought or were created to justify the ban in the first place still flourish. And that means that Mormons of color are still being confronted with those horribly racist ideas and having to challenge them. So I think that is an example of, if the church makes those incremental changes, even if not fully, are they going to also support it with some kind of infrastructure for the community?
Now, I want to bring it back to one of the topics here, that queer sexuality and gender theory is an area that has caused the LDS Church sometimes to make alliances in recent years that would have been unthinkable in prior generations. So I'm thinking about gay marriage in particular, when in California a few years ago, when I was living there and working there, there was a strong alliance between the Roman Catholics, the evangelicals, and the LDS Church, specifically lobbying and spending money together to try to ban or prevent the legalization of gay marriage. But what was remarkable about that was not that they were in concert with each other ideologically, but that they were cooperating together, dare I use the word, ecumenically. And that, do you think that trend could continue? Has it made the LDS Church more permeable, more willing to partner with other religious traditions? Nothing brings people together more like, ideology, let's put it that way. It's a shift, right?
I think that is a trend that's not going away. I think those are partnerships and those are convenient relationships that will remain in place as long as there is overlap in goals. And I think for a while yet, we were just discussing whether or not the church will change its position on some of these issues, but for the short term, those positions will largely stay the same. I think those relationships will remain convenient and useful for them. And when I say for them, I don't just mean for mainstream LDS Church, but I also mean for the Catholic Church or certain evangelical fundamentalist groups. It's about creating a base of political power that maintains the status quo, and that works really well. It's amazing who will be in coalition when certain ideas are at stake.
Well, let me appreciate one more thing before we go to questions about your scholarship, both of you. I learned quite a bit about my Mormon neighbors. And as a gay man, I've sometimes I get tense around Mormons. And this, I realized knowledge is what we all need more of about each other. So there's popular culture interest right now in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, whether it's the TV shows like Under the Banner of Heaven or Oh Mormon No More. The fact is, it's visible more, and the more I learned, the more I appreciate that maybe not everything taught by an institution is what the people are like. And by learning about the history, I feel I've become more open-minded, and I just wanted to appreciate that about your scholarship. I'm going to check the questions. If you either of you want to comment on Under the Banner of Heaven or Mormon No More or anything else in popular culture.
It felt like everything came out in like a span of a week. I know it wasn't that, but that's what it felt like. It was Mormon No More, Under the Banner of Heaven, Keep Sweet. I'm writing a paper on Real Housewives of Salt Lake City. It just like felt all right there. Taylor, I'm curious about if you want to say more. I read your piece on Under the Banner of Heaven, but I'm curious if you thought more about it since that.
Well, I hadn't finished the series before I wrote it. I had seen most of it up until that point. And for those who haven't seen it or who aren't aware of it, it's caused a fascinating division of interpretation, I would say, among viewers, of those who love it, who feel like, especially among Mormon and former Mormon viewers, who say this really represents the tradition and the faith well, and so on, and others who say this feels incredibly alien and doesn't represent at all. It seems like a huge distortion, and so, you know, I don't know if I want to weigh into one side or the other necessarily, but it is fascinating to watch the kind of cultural fracturing over this piece of work. If you don't know the story, it's actually the I guess dramatic version of a book that was written 20 years ago that was a dramatic retelling of a murder that happened 20 years before that. So it's almost a 40-year-old story now. And in some ways has been a kind of staple of controversy in that 40 years ever since. And this is sort of the latest iteration of it. Regardless of where you come down on it, it's pretty fascinating to watch.
I love that non-answer answer.
I did write something about it, and we can put it in the chat if people want to read it. But
you can find it online, and it's a great piece. I thought it was great, and I enjoyed the Hulu series as well as Mormon No More. So for what that's worth, I'm going to read the question that's in the chat, and because I want to do it justice, I'm going to read it as is. And it's from Kristen. Sometimes it feels like there is a disconnect between queer theory and LGBTQ plus advocacy, both in general and specifically in and around the church. Do you worry that a more expansive queer theorizing that acknowledges some of the nuances in the institution might defang advocate movements?
Katie,
I'd love to get your take on this one first.
I think it depends on what your advocacy is striving for. So part of what queer theory does is asks us to consider, are the things that are being advocated for entrenching problematic oppressions or institutions that maybe should be thrown out altogether, and we should try and organize society completely differently. So for example, let's take gay marriage. And this is a hot one right now, right? Because after the Dobbs decision, there's a lot of speculation and concern that Obergefell is going to be overturned. But if you take that from a queer theoretical perspective, there's a lot of activists who are saying same-sex marriage isn't the right fight. And in fact, marriage is a fundamentally conservative institution that allows the state to intrude into our business and delegates rights to only certain people. And in fact, it was based primarily on a white supremacist idea of what it means to have a family and to have gendered relationships. So what if we threw out marriage and we distributed rights and access to resources differently? Now, if you are for gay marriage, that's going to be a queer theoretical response to that is going to be something you reject, right? But if you think about, oh, maybe if we look at the church from a queer theoretical perspective, maybe we need not ask, should gay people allowed to be sealed in the temple also? But what if we look back even more historically? What other kind of sealing relationships were occurring? And it wasn't just marital or sexual relationships. How could that expand our idea of what it means to have a family or to care for one another? So I think it's just it's a perspective issue.
I just had a rainstorm come through my house, so hopefully it's not too loud in the background while I'm trying to answer this question too. But Kristen, it is such a great question, and I think a lot of kind of intellectual wrangling has been spent on the tension between queer theorists and activists. And I think that there's a lot of validity to the worries that sometimes emerge out of this, because queer theorists are sometimes leery of some of the language or ideas that kind of motivate activists, and that those ideas that the activists are using are sometimes the most effective, sometimes the most strategically effective in convincing their interlocutors that they're worth taking seriously. And so I'm sympathetic to that. At the same time, I think that it sometimes is a little bit of a false binary. Queer theorists are activists also, and activists are theorizing at the same time. And so I'm sometimes a little reluctant to kind of buy into the binary between activists and theorists to say, no, look, we're all theorizing and we're all doing activism in important ways, and that it's worth kind of breaking down some of those assumptions of that there are camps here. Instead, I think that it's useful to kind of look around at least what I'm seeing on the ground, that it is actually queer theoretical ideas that are the driving ideas behind much of the activism that's happening in LDS communities currently. I'm seeing a lot more trans inclusive and non-binary approaches to gender and sexuality that are, and these kinds of identities that are sort of coming to the forefront as leaders of these movements, as opposed to, exclusively the sort of, gay men as the leaders of the movement, or lesbians as leaders. We're seeing a lot more, I think, kind of gender fluidity and sexual fluidity as a kind of motivating factor behind the way that many of the kind of leading voices and activists are. I'll give one example of this. I think one of the kind of leading activist voices is a woman who identifies as non-binary, Blair Osler, who writes a book called An Introduction to Queer Mormon Theology, or Queer Mormon Theology, an Introduction, something along those lines, that really embraces a kind of radical queer agenda here. And it's the defining feature, I think, of where most sort of activists are as well. So I would also say that we're seeing these theoretical ideas really kind of informing the activism today in a way that might not have been true 20 years ago, but I think certainly is now.
I'm gonna though I do want to say one thing about that, though. I take from all of this, and for both of your scholarship, a caution as an activist pastor: do not be drawn into the easy political tendency to waver on challenging racism, homophobia, transphobia, misogyny. Do not stand firm. Keep it together. So I'm going to read one last question that Makoto put in the chat, and because I want to do justice to it, I'm going to read it exactly as it is. Thank you both for this great conversation and for your insights into this history. I have a question for Kay Mormon about the relationship between Mormon peculiarity and U.S. nationalism she examines in her book. When you say that Mormon peculiarity discourse is an expression of American exceptionalism, do you mean that America reinforces its exceptionalism by defining Mormons as a peculiar other, or that Mormonism recites that exceptionalism by claiming its own peculiarity?
This is easy, both. Yeah,
Okay.
So Mormon peculiarity is a very malleable discourse. And just very roughly, if you look in the 19th century, it's kind of the first version of what was articulated there. The idea that Mormons are peculiar, that Mormonism is peculiar, becomes a foil against which the US can say, we are normal, we are superior, we deserve to be the ones in charge and to control. I'm generalizing here, but you get the idea. The 20th century goes much more into the second version that was articulated there of, oh, look, they are the epitome of what it means to be American. They are doing such a good job. Everyone should look to them about what to do. And in fact, oftentimes that meant not just large families and have certain kinds of values, et cetera, but it also meant, oh, they have this problem with racism. That's okay, we're just going to ignore it, which is a very common, more American response to racism. So yeah, both.
Great. I'm going to ask you each 1 minute each, your final parting thought. The thing that later, if you hadn't said it, you'd have thought, oh my God, why didn't I say that? Taylor, you go first. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you so much. Jim, I think that what you said earlier is such a useful reminder that queer and LDS communities have often found one another a little bit uncomfortable to be around. And I think that a kind of further conversation and understanding is an important remedy to all of that. And one of the places where that's kind of the most interesting place where that's happening, I think, is among queer LDS communities, where they're really having these conversations out themselves online, at conferences, in writing and other venues. And so kind of keeping an eye on those voices is, I think, a really interesting place to be looking at right now.
Cool. And Katie?
Similar to Taylor's comment, I would say Mormonism tends to be, even for LGBTQ religious historians, tends to be a blind spot where stereotypes reign. And I would encourage you to kind of look into LGBTQ Mormon communities and the history of the church, because it's much more complex than we have been led to believe. And there's a lot of interesting examples, both historically and contemporarily, around how to organize, how to resist, how to kind of morph thinking or change thinking depending on the context that you're having to work within. I find Mormonism just so fascinating in those respects. There's much more there than people have been allowed to believe there is.
Great. Thank you both. This has been fascinating. I really appreciate it. And I know Mark will do this, but I'm going to say it too. Buy this book, support these authors and their research.
Thank you so much, Katie, Taylor, and Jim, for this thoughtful and stimulating dialogue. Just, I think, beginning to scratch the surface of the amazing scholarship that Katie and Taylor have done, which again, you can read more about in their books. And thanks to those of you who watched and offered your comments and questions. Within a few days, you will receive an email with a link to a recording of tonight's program that you can share with friends and colleagues. If you are interested in more opportunities to explore the history of queer religious movements, remember to check out the LGBTQ-RAN website, and particularly our events page. There you will find announcements of future online programs, as well as recordings of past presentations. We're taking a break from our monthly webinar series in August, but we will be back in September. Details of that webinar will be announced soon. In closing, I remind you that LGBTQ-RAN is the first and foremost source of information on queer religious history. We are a small operation that is funded through the generosity of friends like you. So if you would like to see more programs like this one, and if you share our commitment to ensure that future generations will hear our voices and stories, please help make this happen with your gift. Finally, I remind you that if you would like to offer personal greetings or comments to one of the presenters, stay here and you will be invited into the Zoom room with them. I close with one more thank you to our awesome presenters and offer good night to all.